I am so honored to introduce our next panel. These are three of my favorite people on the planet. Father David Kelly from Precious Blood Ministry has been a leader in restorative justice principles, a man of integrity and courage. I'm sure most people at this event know who he is, and I'm not going to belabor the introductions. Emmanuel Andre, again, a leader in the community, not a public defense lawyer, but a defense lawyer, and also working in community with youth. And finally, Xavier Matthey, who is the co-director of the Center for the Fair Sentencing of Youth. Is that right? Fair Sentencing of Children. Known fondly to me as my son-in-law. He is not married to anybody in my family, but he is my son-in-law. And with that, I think Emmanuel will moderate and facilitate what I think will be an extraordinary discussion between Father Kelly and Xavier McElrath-Bey. Gentlemen, good morning.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here again on this beautiful Saturday morning, and you're still with us. Why don't we just start there? Let's just start and turn over the floor to maybe Xavier, if you want to just start us off on how did you get to where you got to? Introduce us to who is Xavier.
Thank you so much. That will require a very complex answer, but I really appreciate the space and opportunity to be here. And first I want to apologize. I wasn't able to experience the full, the earlier sessions. And when I arrived, the first voice I heard was Honorable Judge Ocasio, and I was like, love, that's love. Happy to be here. And my mother-in-law, one of my greatest, supporters in my life, when she asked me to be here and to share my experience, or that of many others, in fact, I would never hesitate at the chance. And so I'm just happy to be here. I think it's appropriate that I do share a little bit about my past experience of who I am. And I'll just start, that currently in my life, I have the role of co-executive director at the Campaign for the Fair Sentencing of Youth, as Herschella has shared. My waking moments are really just a matter of just constantly trying to strategize and work alongside amazing justice warriors to ensure meaningful opportunities for release for kids across the country who were deemed as the worst of the worst. And I'm very passionate about that work. And the reason why is because I was once one of them. At the very young age of 13, standing in the courtroom, and I'll never forget the judge looking down upon me and stating that I was incorrigible. He said I would never change. The state's attorney later stated, the defendant has an extensive juvenile arrest record indicative of violent nature, meaning that I was someone who was incapable of change. I was someone who was inherently evil. And with that, I was instantly transferred into the adult criminal court. There I met Herschella, someone who really in so many ways gave me a different sense of what it would mean to be in the courtroom. Prior to that, it was always, in my previous 19 arrests and 7 convictions throughout my childhood, it was a public defender that would come to the bullpen, introduce him or herself, walk me into a courtroom, go through the case with those in the room, speaking a language I didn't understand, anxiously awaiting more information once I got back to the bullpen. And that would be the last I would perhaps see this public defender. And if there was a continuance, it would be nothing but the same. There was no human connection for me in those earlier experiences. But when Herschella came to visit me, her questions were very on point in regards to my experience. Her questions were about how I was doing, whether or not my mother had came to visit me. What was my childhood like growing up? What were some of the challenges I had? And what I sensed is that she really wanted to know who I was as a person. And with that, and understanding all the traumas I had experienced, understanding that I was a kid who experienced severe trauma and neglect and abuse and had been in and out the foster care system, was a gunshot victim at the age of 11 when I almost lost my life. Just all this information that she came to know and understand, and most importantly, recognizing me as a person, as someone who was not inherently evil as they had deemed. And with that information, she advocated very strongly for me. The fact of the matter is that the state's attorney wanted to give me 40 years in prison as a cop out, as a plea deal. And Herschella went into a conference with the state's attorney and judge, came out of that room hours later in tears, and told me what she felt was not the ideal outcome. But for me and my impetuous and risk-taking mind and my young and immature thoughts, thought it was far better than what I was faced with. And the fact of the matter is that it was. I was given a 25-year sentence. But Herschella didn't want to offer she didn't want to tell me that. She didn't want to have to deal with that because she had a son that was my age. She understood that I would never go to high school, that I would never step foot into the DMV at age 16 to excitedly pursue my driver's license. She knew all these developmental milestones, and most importantly, all the risks that I would take going into the adult system as a small, vulnerable child, weighing only 110 pounds and probably 5'1", 5'2". She understood that I was in for a rough road. And that was the case. I experienced a lot of unfortunate experiences there. And while inside the system, starting with the juvenile system into the adult system, I spent numerous stints in solitary confinement, was in circumstances that exposed me to violence and forced me to do things I didn't want to do, quite frankly. But thankfully, I met some amazing people there in the system who believed in me and who poured into me. Father Kelly, who you see here with us, is one of them. In fact, he had convinced me that I was worthy of communion during one of the Saturday masses. After numerous times I had refused to step up and receive it, he spoke and said that if you feel like you're unworthy of this, if you feel like this is something that you don't deserve, then this is exactly for you. And after that communion, I never felt the shame. I never felt uncomfortable going up there. And I was always a child of faith. I always prayed. Oftentimes for God to help me in the courtroom, but the reality is that I was no different from any other child in my space. We're all just kids, and inside the system, obviously I grew up. All the things that they said about me were completely untrue. By age 18, I was already going into my first college courses. By the time I was 21, I had already earned an Associate of Arts in General Education, an Associate of Arts and Associate in General Education, certificate in Computer Technology, went on to earn a bachelor's degree in Social Science from Roosevelt University through Pell Grant opportunities that were provided to us, and came out of prison at age 26 with a remorseful heart and desire to make a difference in my community. This is in 2002 when I stepped out of prison at age 26, going on 27. And though it was challenging, I was fortunate to have opportunities to finally be able to work in communities that were much like the ones I grew up in. And then soon after, alongside Father Kelly again, interestingly, in back of the yards, working with troubled youth who were trying to navigate the barriers and violence that shaped their lives. After working at St. John of God for a number of years, I went on to work at Northwestern University as a clinical research interviewer. And after 5 years there, I joined the Campaign for the Fair Sentencing of Youth. First time ever working on a national level, but just being my authentic self, being vulnerable, sharing, and just really hoping that people can see, the good in everyone, and particularly kids who have unique capacity for change. In 2016, my story was shared in the WGN news segment. And interestingly, much like other experiences, I didn't anticipate what would come. Within the matter of a week and a half after that news segment came out, and many in Chicago saw it and were messaging me and calling me and saying amazing work that I was doing. I got one email that would change my life forever. And that email came, at a time when I was still, in fact, up until that point, and perhaps even since I was a child, and perhaps more so through the growing and the growing sense of remorse that I had became much stronger. And that is that there was something very unresolved in my life. And that is the fact that I was tormented in my soul and in my heart from my involvement in the loss of another kid's life. I was deeply, troubled by the thought of who I was as a child, recognizing all those traumas, and as an adult, becoming a father myself, all these experiences that, perhaps made the moment appropriate. And when I opened the email, the header said, Cynthia Alonso. I opened it up and she said, "Hi, my name is Cynthia, and I am the sister of Pedro Martinez." Pedro was a child who I was responsible for the loss of his life alongside other youth and young adults who were part of the gang that I was involved in. And when I read that sentence, my heart dropped. I would just simply say I didn't know what to do. I was literally physically, emotionally, spiritually paralyzed, because though I had been advocating for restorative justice, though I had been working and had been to funerals and sat alongside mothers who were weeping and crying for the loss of their child, though I had been intervening in gang violence and literally had bullets flying past my head in the midst of those mediations, like literally, like I just never anticipated that I would experience a moment like this, that I felt suddenly stripped away all of who I was in that moment. It didn't matter that I was an advocate. It didn't matter that I was fighting for compassion in the courts. It didn't matter that, I was someone who had changed. For me in that moment, what mattered was what I did when I was 13 years old. And that family who's still suffering as a result of that. And being stuck and not knowing what to do, I decided to reach out to Father Kelly, and it's funny, like the first person I called, and it's like, if you need a mechanic, you call a mechanic, right? You need a doctor, you're feeling sick, you go to the hospital, and for me, Father Kelly, someone who once pulled me out of my cell when I was 11 years old, and oftentimes soon after, when I was in solitary confinement, again, someone who convinced me I was worthy of communion, someone who I had worked alongside and believed in me. Like, I just knew I had to talk to Father Kelly, and I reached out to him. And I remember sharing the email, and I remember being in tears. I remember Father Kelly telling me that it's gonna be okay, and that maybe this is something that was meant to happen, and I felt that, and it was, but yet it was still a very scary thing. How do you stand in the presence of people who want to see you after 26 years of having done something so wrong to them? I don't know who these people are. And when I reached out to Father Kelly, I asked him, what did he think would be the best way of going about it? And then instantly I found myself, though I've been trained in restorative justice, from this side, as someone who was going through it, it felt altogether something new and scary, though I knew I had to go through it. And I remember telling Father Kelly that I trusted him and that I, whatever he thinks is the best way of going about it. I gave him Cynthia's number, which she had provided in the email. And from there, I'm gonna hand it over to Father Kelly to share what were those initial interactions like, what helped prepare us for the day that we did eventually meet up.
Thanks, Xavier. Appreciate it. So maybe a little bit of context is, obviously I'm a Catholic priest, but I've been working in jails and detention centers all my adult life, almost entirely here in Chicago on the South Side. Working for 40 plus years in Cook County Juvenile Detention Center and many years in Cook County Jail in a parish-based jail ministry. So I lived in the neighborhood and I went into the jails and juvenile detention center. And early on, when I would go to court, oftentimes with a young person or a family member, I would know both sides of the one who did the harm and the one who was harmed. And so often I'd walk home feeling disappointed, feeling as though nothing really was about healing or bringing back any kind of restoration to the family or to the community. And some of those were very personal, in which I knew the persons very well. And particular one, a young man who was a part of our parish center, was shot multiple times, and I would go from the jail or from the hospital bed where he was in intensive care, and eventually I'd go to the jail to visit the person who shot him because I knew him as well, and I'd go back and forth. And interestingly, Alberto, the kid who was shot, knew I was going to leave his room and go visit the person who shot him, and the young man, Wilfredo, the one who did the shooting, was in Cook County Jail, Division 9, knew that when I left his cell, that I was going to go to the hospital and visit the person who would ultimately testify against him in court. And both of them could wrap their heads around that because they understood who we were and what we tried to do. So in 2002, we started Precious Blood Ministry of Reconciliation, and that is a restorative justice organization on the south side of Chicago, working with those who have been harmed and those who do harm. And so, being in the juvenile detention center as long as I have been, I knew Xavier when he first came in. And that was the relationship that we forged over these years, which allowed him to reach out to me and have a bit of trust in me that I had his best interests at heart. And the very core of restorative justice is about relationships. And so as Xavier explained the situation, gave me Cynthia's contact information, I reached out to Cynthia and asked if she'd be willing to talk with me. And she said she would, and she wanted to bring her family too to talk with me. And so we made an arrangement where they would come to the center and we would sit and we would talk, and I asked them what they hoped would come out of this if they wanted to sit in this space with Xavier. And they gave me a whole lot of stuff of what they wanted. They wanted to know what happened, why it happened, a lot of things, and they wanted to talk to him. And as we went on and on, there was like 25 or 30 family members in that space. And so anybody that is part of restorative justice and doing a peacemaking circle know that that's just too many people to have an intimate conversation. And so I asked them if they could whittle this down to, maybe 12 family members. And they really didn't like that. But then I said, well, we can do multiple circles too. So this is not the only time we can sit in this space. And ultimately, they got it down to about 12. There's like 12 siblings. So they got the siblings and a couple of children, nephews of Pedro. And I then said to them, what do you want to know? And they had many questions they wanted Xavier to answer. And as we talked and built a relationship with one another, myself and the family of Pedro, Cynthia and her family, I let them know that they might not get everything they wanted. Because some of the things Xavier just didn't know. And so I didn't want him to go into that space, into a peacemaking circle, expecting one thing and then coming home disappointed because that wasn't what they heard. So we talked a long time, multiple occasions, about what was possible and ultimately what Xavier could provide them with. And I asked them if they were willing to sit in that space, and they were very much willing to sit in that space. And then in my conversation with Xavier too, part of a peacemaking circle is really creating a safe environment built around really respect. You can have high emotions, and those emotions can be raw, but you ultimately have to agree to respect one another and not cause someone to feel unsafe. And the other things is truth telling and the ability to listen. And if you sit in a circle, it's an indigenous practice in which you create a safe enough space, physically a safe space. You sit in a circle and use a talking piece, a sacred object, and the only person who speaks is the person who has the talking piece. So it's really geared toward really equality, a real democratic kind of a setting in which everybody's voice is important. No one has a stronger or more important voice than another person. Asked Xavier who he wanted in that space, because I knew 12 family members of Pedro were going to come, or 12 or more were going to come to this circle. And I didn't want him to feel like he was alone. And so he told me a number of different people that he wanted in that space. And so we created this place, set it up on I believe it was a Saturday, and everybody would show up to Precious Blood here on the south side. And we have a circle room set up always. And we gathered. And when Cynthia and her family came, by this time I knew them a little bit. So I was pretty confident that I knew that they weren't really out to do anybody any harm. They really just wanted answers. And when they came with carloads, frankly, of food that they wanted to bring to the space. And so, but after our circle, we were going to have all this food. And as Xavier and others could attest, it's incredible food. So there's this sense of hospitality, a sense of really creating a space that's different than other kinds of spaces. It's not a mediation, but rather it's a sacred space where people can really speak their truth and hear their truth. And so that's what the circle was all about. And in the very beginning, is you always build relationships before you get into, in this particular case, what happened and why it happened, you always build relationships. So around the circle, people spoke to who they were, and they could share their truth. And they could speak to who Pedro was to this family, who still held him in high regard. And if I recall, there was one of the family members, Cynthia, brought a large picture of Pedro that we were able to place in that space because we wanted to make sure we remembered why we were there and honor his name and who he was even to this day. And so that's kind of the context of that space and what we did. And my role was just to keep that space safe and allow the process to move along. So I'm going to throw it back to Xavier you can kind of share a little bit more, and Cynthia, if you like, to share a little bit more from your perspective, because this is the true perspective of what happened in that space.
Thank you so much. And, I just want to say that, yes, look on your screen. I want to encourage you all to look at your screen. You're going to see someone by the name of Cynthia Alonso. And Cynthia was the one who reached out to me. And, for me, it's just an extraordinary and amazing opportunity to share that experience, but most importantly, to know that, we can still be a part of the healing just years after, many years after, and still. But I have to admit, leading up to that day, again, I was very afraid. I did reach out to Cynthia and I had conversation with her for hours. She asked me questions and things that she needed to know. And I honestly, shared, and when things I didn't know, I was honest about that as well. And, those earlier conversations that gave me a sense that Cynthia's heart was in a very extraordinary place. But what she wanted was for that same place to be the reality of her siblings and her loved ones, her nieces and nephews and others who had suffered, many of whom weren't even alive during the time of Pedro's passing. But as you can imagine, the trauma and sadness ripples through the generations, and it shaped their lives in many ways. I came to learn to understand this through Cynthia and really just, being an open ear to understand that. And I had a chance to share about myself as well. Perhaps Cynthia had high hopes about that experience, but I was afraid. And I remember on the day arriving at Precious Blood, I pulled into the parking lot and I saw a number of Pedro's family members there standing next to some vehicles with bags in their hands. And I remember seeing the older brother, Juan, catching my eye. And though I had a sense of who they might be, his reaction definitely confirmed that. And that is that he saw me, he turned away, and he said something in Spanish, and he had basically ushered everyone upstairs right away. And for me, not understanding and knowing where their hearts were at as a whole, having some confidence in Cynthia of what, the experience would possibly entail. And the moment that happened, I interpreted it, as that they did not want to be in my presence, But then I also reflected and realized that Xavier's been over 26, 27 years. They probably thought about this moment since then, being able to confront someone who was involved in that. Like, perhaps they don't want that to happen in a parking lot. Or perhaps they're going up, the older brother wants to create a space that's safe for me to be able to walk up those steps and not feel uncomfortable or afraid, to give me a moment to reflect and to process that. And while they're in the parking lot, and though it was hard for me to go up those steps, the individual had pulled up, and that person was Jose Manteca. Jose Manteca was a friend of Pedro's, but someone who had grown and matured just like me. And so while he worked on that side of the tracks, working with the youth who were part of that gang that I was once a rival with, I worked on this side. And soon after, we began collaborating in our community. I started driving a small yellow bus across the viaduct, 3 blocks. All the kids will hop on. And honestly, I felt like I was jeopardizing my life, but I had strong faith that I was doing God's work and God's not going to let nothing happen to me. But the fact of the matter is that all it took was someone on that side to say, that's him. He's the one responsible. And any of those individuals could have sought retribution. And in fact, I learned years later that Jose Manteca, he actually once thought about that when he saw me crossing that viaduct before he got to know who I was today. And when I met him in the parking lot, he embraced me. He told me, Xavier, you're a strong person, man. I don't know if I would even be able to do this. And I said, man, I'm not strong. I'm scared as hell. I started getting emotional. And I remember walking up those steps with him. And I remember saying, I have to go to the bathroom. And so I just got away for a moment. I fought back my tears. And when I walked to the doorway of that main space where all his family members were, I was greeted with Oscar and Maria Pike and Jose once again at the doorway. And Maria handed me a small cross. And other individuals who were there, Shoba, Mahadev, Maria Pike, others who were there were not just there to support me, but were there also to support Pedro's family. And when I walked in, that gave me great consolation to know I was greeted by them. And I slowly worked my way towards the table where they were sitting and congregating. I remember not knowing how to interact. What do you do when you walk into a room like that? Do you look them in their eyes? Do you smile? Do you shake their hand? What do you do when you walk into a room of people who you've offended so in such a devastating way? And for me, I just prayed and asked God to just guide me in that space. And I remember slowly but surely beginning to make eye contact. And I looked up at the nephews and the younger ones first. And I remember hearing Shoba talking to one of the nephews. He had talked about how, he had, just came back from Europe, and he had, he was going to college and was doing amazing and great things with his life. And I remember soon after that, Cynthia walking in the door. Cynthia wasn't there initially. When she walked in the door, she walked up to me and she handed me a big giant portrait of Pedro with a smiling face. I think his 7th or 8th grade school picture. And she said, here, do something with this. And I didn't know how to respond in that moment. I was caught off guard. Instantly, I was struck emotionally, and I began to cry because I saw his face. And I broke around the corner into the circle space, ran out the back. But before that, I put his photo, his big portrait, on the easel that faced the circle. And I went into the bathroom, and I was fighting back tears, and I kept telling myself, don't cry in front of them. You're not, I felt my heart, I wasn't worthy of crying in their presence, that it wasn't about me, that they were the ones who suffered. They were the ones who deserved to have tears. They were the ones who deserved to have anger, resentment, hate. And I prepared myself for that. And I told myself, no matter what they say, no matter what they do, Xavier, do not speak out against it. Do not, if they even so much as swing on you, don't even cover up. Like, that's how I felt in my heart. And I made my way back into that room, wiping my tears. And I remember Father Kelly saying, everyone come into the circle room, and we all sat down. Most of the people who I knew sat closest to me, and those who I didn't know, who were mostly Pedro's family, sat the furthest away from me. And I remember Father Kelly saying, I want everybody to grab the ribbon on your chair. There was a small ribbon on all of our chairs, and he said, I want you to put it on your lap, and I want you to tie it to the person next to you. We're gonna go in order. And I want you to talk about the one person who made a difference in your life. And Father Kelly demonstrated that first, and soon after others I knew. And the first person that I heard from the first person I remember, actually, perhaps there were others, but the one that stood out to me the most in that moment, in that circle, in that round in particular, was the youngest nephew, who looked across the room to his brother in tears and told him how much he meant to him, how much he appreciated him being in his corner during difficult times. And it was then that I realized that this is much more than about me and Pedro and what happened years back. This was really about a family that needed to heal. I realized that perhaps the mission, the journey here, the goal that Cynthia has is beyond what I understood. She understood the pain that existed in her family, the need for them to come together. And I came to learn through that circle all the tragedies that happened as a result of Pedro's passing. When I was in that courtroom and told to face towards the judge and not look back in the juvenile court, I didn't see her family. When I was in Cook County and going to, the numerous continuances and eventually that big and important fight for my life, there was tinted glass behind me. I couldn't see her family. I never once laid eyes on her family. And even when I expressed emotion and remorse in the police station. And though that was coerced, yes, it was coerced, and that's a whole different story. But although I expressed remorse, those things were held against me. Like the system, it was the inverse reality of all that I was going to experience on this day. And I had the freedom to speak from my heart. And after learning so many things, it was hard for me to do that. I learned that two of Cynthia's sisters, Pedro's sisters, had experienced miscarriages soon after Pedro's passing. One didn't even know she was pregnant. The emotional travail of loss. Pedro was so beloved. The community loved Pedro. His family was torn. And I learned that in that room. And I also learned that Victor, one of the brothers who's closest in age to Pedro, because of the trauma of losing his brother, the anger and hurt that he felt, had also soon after was involved in an accident. As a result of acting out of that trauma, he jumped out of a moving vehicle to confront some people, and sadly his foot skipped the cement and he hit his head on the ground, and it separated his brain from his spinal cord. He was instantly paralyzed, unable to walk, talk, feed himself. He never recuperated. 3 decades later, to this very day, he's still there in a nursing home. And on that time, when I learned it, I realized that their family had been devastating. The ripple effect of violence in our communities is so profound and unimaginable for those who stand in the courtroom. And yet the need for healing is also so much more than what we think. And when it came time for me to speak and share about who changed my life, though I was hesitant because I didn't want to seem selfish, I had to be honest, and that was Pedro. The fact that it matters that Pedro changed my life, the remorse that I felt since I was a kid, thoughts of him being no different from me. He really was no different from me in terms of, geography and race and experience of growing up in a violence, trauma-filled environment as a child. And he was impressionable and risk-taking. He was all the things that I know and understood as are the hallmarks of adolescence, but he was not a bad child. He didn't deserve that. And I came to learn in that room soon after, moments later, when each of them stood up and embraced me and told me they forgive me, I came to understand through their words that I was a victim too, and that I was also someone who didn't deserve that. I learned in that room that what they wanted more from me was to continue to do the work that I was doing, that they had been following me all along and wanted to encourage me. But some other family members were not in that room. Octavio, the oldest brother, one of the older brothers, couldn't be there because he wasn't ready for that, understandably. And it wasn't until months later when I visited Victor, who was in a nursing home, alongside him, Cynthia, and another brother, that I finally had a chance to be in a room with Octavio. And while there, it was hard for us to make eye contact. And eventually we did begin to exchange words. Eventually we did have a sense of, though we haven't talked about it directly, I did sense that he in some ways had in part forgiven me. And I know the healing continues to this very day. I share all this to say that, as much as we advocate in courts for compassion, as much as we talk and try to educate DAs to, in particular DAs who feel like their hands are tied because of laws, to seek creative ways to ensure meaningful opportunities for release. Though we talk about restorative justice in our communities and trying to, circumvent traditional ways of going about justice and trying to re-envision something more meaningful, healing, and helpful for our community members, like I know that it's not an easy thing to grapple with. It wasn't easy for us to step into that room, but it was a moment when we were able to be proximate, to share our deepest feelings, to be human with each other, and to be able to be honest and free to share. It was then when we were able to find healing. When they first came, I didn't know that those bags had food. I came to learn a time later that they had literally stood up all night, Cynthia and her sisters, and not to be sexist, but perhaps some of the brothers too, were up cooking some of Pedro's favorite dishes, and they brought it with the intent of breaking bread. And Cynthia reminded me not long ago about the prodigal son, and when he returned, and how there was a feast waiting for him. I wasn't in my heart worthy of that. And to this day, I still struggle, to be honest with you. But there's something more than what we think when it comes to justice. There's something much more about compassion and love and the higher purpose and the healing that needs to take place in our communities. Cynthia understands that. And I just want to give Cynthia a chance to share here. We're talking about her as if she's not even here, but I want to just give you a chance to just share some thoughts, Cynthia, if you don't mind, whatever comes to your heart at this moment.
Well, I didn't write nothing today. But yeah, all that Xavier just said was actually what happened. And the way I see things, or the way I think, is that we as parents, what do we do when one of our children does something that is wrong? Like, and they come and they say, "Mom, I'm sorry for what I did," or, for whatever I did. Of course, we as parents, we're going to forgive our children because we love them. So in the same way, I believe that that's how God wants it to be. God wouldn't have no mercy towards those that change their hearts and that are willing to be better. So that's what I believe in, and that's what I try to be about. I try to, be compassionate and loving towards others all the time. So that's about it. You know that I love you and that I admire you. I admire the work you're doing. I believe everybody's capable of changing and becoming better. That's it.
Thank you, Cynthia. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you all. So much has come out of just this brief discussion. What is it, as we look around on the screen on this beautiful Saturday, you see many lawyers, many judges, law students, social workers, other professionals in the justice system. Father Dave, Xavier, even Cynthia, what's one thing you want us to keep in mind as we think about this idea of beyond punishment?
I think one of the things that I would love to stress is the role of community. I think too often people in the legal profession see the community as the problem and where all the evil happens or whatever. And in my experience, the community is precisely where the healing is possible. That if we create spaces and places for people to come together, if you do the work that it's necessary prior to coming together, that those spaces can be very healing. I think one of the things, Xavier, you mentioned it, but the role of Jose Monteca in that circle. Jose Monteca was a friend of Pedro, the opposite gang as Xavier, but he was really the one who stood in that in between and allowed them to come together in a real way, because he was Pedro's friend, a good friend, and yet he spoke to the situation and really helped people to see things a little differently. And he wasn't trained as anything. He was just a community person, a person from the community. And so I think that's hugely important. So I think that's one of the things I would really like people to understand, is how powerful the community can be in these kinds of settings.
I would also share that, oftentimes we think about restorative justice, we think about those who have committed certain types of harm. And, though it seems more feasible, I think that when it comes to violent, offenses or violent crime, and where healing is very critical, in fact, and where scars are much deeper, I think we should give an opportunity or be creative in ways that allow us to do something different. Cynthia, I just want to say I love you too. And for me, hearing you share from a motherly perspective, And for me to think about that from a fatherly perspective, like, it's like, your child, what would you want for your child? And I think it's hard for us to see that. It's interesting because in the work that I do, I have the great fortune of working alongside people who have lost loved ones to violence and believe deeply and second chances for kids. And one of the things that I've heard from many of them, and one woman in particular, Linda White from Texas, she said, Xavier, when this first happened, when I first lost my daughter, I didn't know where to turn. I needed to be around people who understood my hurt and my pain. She joined groups that were, advocating for punishment and were advocating for retribution and were fighting every single law that pertained to youth sentencing and were there and testifying and she realized that that was not contributing to her healing journey. She said, Xavier, it wasn't until I learned about restorative justice. It wasn't until I was honest with myself and recognizing the needs that I really had, and that was to talk to the people who took my daughter away. That is to understand why. That is to convince myself that this world is not as evil as it has become portrayed to me through my loss. It's sad because, Pedro's siblings and Cynthia had shared with me that once Pedro had passed away, her parents had become extremely strict, as if there was a monster out there waiting to snatch their children. They weren't able to have many friends. They weren't able to socialize and go out and go to parties and experience normal things in the community. They were sheltered. And though they became close, and still to this very day, I see their way they engage on Facebook, like they are still a very close-knit family, and that's a beautiful thing. But a lot of that happened as a result because of the fear of letting their kids go out and to experience and socialize and to be one with outside world. And it just speaks to the need for healing that needs to take place for us. And I think having the opportunity to see and hear about moments like this and to know that they're not unique, to understand that this is something that can happen and in particular should happen for those who experience the deepest and most challenging harms in life. I think the moment we get beyond trying to differentiate who should be worthy of this, I think that's when we'll be in a better place.
Cynthia, is there anything you want us to think about?
Well, that is also true. Since that happened, I believe I didn't know, but I was facing like trauma, because I was 12 back then. So most of my, my emotions or whatever that I was feeling, I would just cry by myself. I often tell Xavier, I used to hide myself in the closet, and I used to put myself to sleep, crying because, I guess all of us were suffering, but we didn't know, there were resources for us to get like help, like psychological help back then or anything. So, like after this meeting that happened at Precious Blood, I've been meeting, beautiful people with beautiful hearts that like I couldn't speak the way I'm speaking right now. I hold it all inside, and now I'm able to be able to speak because I've been going to circles, and I share. So it's like it's kind of helping me heal. And I'm very grateful for having Precious Blood in my life. They're amazing people, that are always willing to help, the community. That's it.
Thank you. So for those who, I'm gonna put on my prosecutor hat on. I know Father Dave is rolling his eyes right now because he knows how I'm a horrible prosecutor. But for those who, I'm a prosecutor or I'm a defense attorney out there, we have a case we're struggling with, or I'm a judge, but it's a violent case. And we know about the Restorative Justice Court in North Lawndale. We know about the RJ courts in Inglewood and other places, but it's a horrible case that's not in one of these communities, and it's a violent case. Help us think through that in terms of the possibility of restorative practices, if any, in that. Father Dave, Xavier, or Cynthia, help us think through what do we do with that?
I think in one way, I'll just start, but one way, it's not about the end result so much as about the journey. It's really about reaching out to people, as Cynthia so clearly said, it's about the harm and the hurt that families go through, and having someone and a community there to acknowledge their pain and their hurt without an ultimate goal in mind necessarily, but rather just that journey. And for me too, the person who perhaps has done the harm is going through his or her own journey, and their family are going through their own journey, and to have people accompany them along that way. I love the quote that Fania Davis says in her book on restorative justice. She says, "Justice is a healing ground, not a battleground." So it's really about creating spaces and places where people can begin to heal, and that we set aside our addiction to punishment and jail and really focus on healing, and then allow that to unfold. And accountability is so much a part of restorative justice. It's not about, oh, gee, that wasn't so bad. Oftentimes it is so bad, it's horrific. And so really addressing those issues as well, but from a lens of trying to nurture community, communion, coming back together is what I focus on. And in that you hold people accountable, but accountability in which they are accountable to help repair whatever the harm that was done, and do as much as possible to do that, rather than the accountability that we seem to think is just about hurting somebody or punishing somebody or years in prison.
I think, I feel fortunate because I had a chance to experience restorative justice after my release, but I also had the great privilege and was really just blessed to have the staunch advocacy of Herschella in the courtroom, who, despite the fact that the existing order of things didn't allow for restorative practices and outcomes, fought from that place in their heart. And I think that, and once again, from the mother's perspective, right? Like, what does it mean to truly have compassion? I'm thinking about my experience when I was, there's so much that I haven't shared. And I would just say, and I appreciate what someone said earlier during one of the breakouts, and that is that trauma is a dominant theme in all of our lives. I almost lost my life when I was 11 years old, when I was shot in my face. I was exposed to weapons and violence throughout my youth, sadly. In that instance, I would have been a victim, but just a couple of years later, and though the repeated cycle of victimization and offense that I experienced throughout my childhood, it depended when and where you caught me, where my life was at, whether I was in a hospital or detention center, or much like Cynthia, hiding in a closet because of an abusive stepfather. Understand, for me, and for many kids in our communities, we're not just one thing. We are, our lives reflect the environment. And because, we're so, underdeveloped in our mentality and our capacity to weigh consequences, it's so easy for us to fall through that black pit, like that dark hole between the age of like 9 and 18 or 19. And then we're learning through neuroscience, even more so, even still existing up into your early to mid 20s, like it is a very vulnerable time in our lives. And because that is the case, because kids can change and the plasticity of the brain is understood, along with the neuroscience that speak to their impetuous and risk-taking ways, like we as adults, as parents, as leaders, as judges and others, like we need to recognize and embrace that and say, no child should ever be regarded as a throwaway. We cannot do that. And so how can we bring a reform-minded practices into a space and help change the culture that will soon allow for more restorative approaches? I think we're still steeped in an overly punitive system that makes thoughts of restorative justice hard to embrace. But I think that the more we work on ourselves and we build out and build together and have community with one another, and see our kids as one and the same, neither just victims nor just offenders, so to speak. In fact, let's do away with that offender language. And I share it in this space because, you know, I know that this is the lingo, but I want to say that, you know, let's not strip our kids of their humanity by using these terms either. Let's recognize them as children. And so I just want to say that the more we work on ourselves and we start to embrace the higher truths, the moral obligations we have as leaders, as adults, parents, and really just lean in on our intuition around compassion and what we would want for our kids, I think we'll be in a better place. And let's be creative, right? Let's be creative, you know, and let's create an opportunity. Leaders in these courts, please be creative and give people in that space an opportunity to engage one another, to share, and to get beyond those harms. Because no matter what happens in that courtroom, no matter how many years are given, no matter what, at the end of the day, those families return home deeply scarred. And that trauma manifests in our community and repeats the cycle of violence over and over again. And so I just wanted to say that, you know, let's give ourselves a break and these punishments. Let's love our kids and let's be creative, you know?
Thank you. Cynthia, or feel free to answer this question though, in that thought of let's be creative in that spirit. Are there any places in the Chicagoland area that we should know of that you believe are being creative when it comes to conflicts of violence? Any organizations or systems out there?
I mean, Precious Blood for me that's my home community center. Like, and I see and bear witness to it when I arrive there. You know, probably Kelly probably won't like me sharing this, but like the fact of the matter is that he meets kids at every point of their lives, right? And sometimes these kids, you know, and just remind ourselves they're kids, they're knuckleheads, they act out in that space, you know. they, you know, sometimes because of the poverty, because of all the traumas and all the things, the lack of trust, like these are relationships that continually build. And, you know, I can say that, you know, in every instance of, you know, indiscretion or mistakes that they make, the unconditional positive regard that I witnessed in that space, even in times when I remember one kid ran out the back door with one of the bikes. I remember when one kid stole a laptop, and during a wonderful, beautiful community gathering, one of the persons came up missing, and a woman had to catch a plane hours later, right? Like, you remember that, Father Kelly? Like, there are things that happen that these kids are like, oh my God, they test you. They make you want to just give up sometimes. But I just want you to just remember and think about the people who have grown and matured, who are doing this work, direct impacted leaders who have experienced it all and are leading the movement for fair sentencing of youth or justice reform. They're no different from these kids. They have great potential. And interestingly, I would say, if you want to create something meaningful, allow our community members, but in particular those who've been through it, to lead in those conversations, because that would be a very important key element of anything that's successful in regards to restorative healing.
You know, let me just say, Emmanuel, you know this, but Precious Blood is just one of the restorative justice organizations in the city that we have a network, a collaboration, what we call community restorative justice hubs throughout the city. Emmanuel leading one of those on the north side. And the idea is that a person should not have to leave their community to find support, that in those spaces, in those communities, there ought to be places where people feel radical hospitality and accompaniment. And so we put a group of us of organizations, non-for-profits came together and started the community restorative justice hubs, in which we can support one another, do training academy and different kinds of things to really enhance the community's capability and capacity to really deal with some of these cases, so that we're trained in this. This is not just something, oh, I'm a nice guy, so I like doing this. It's a training. And one of the things we're working on is really to reach out into our community and work hard to build the relationships within this community and have them understand and experience the power of restorative justice, the power of coming together in a safe environment and speaking and hearing truth, and to allow the community to deal with so many of the issues that are happening within our community that don't really require the police or the courts to deal with. I think we have gotten into a place in our communities where we think somebody else has to come in and fix things. But I think what we're working on is really building a community of for lack of a word, a beloved community, a healthy community in which we can really deal with some of these issues ourselves and come together as neighbors and as organizations within a community.
Poetically stated. I want to acknowledge the time, and I can imagine Herschella looking at me right now, making sure I end this on time, especially because we stand between everybody and lunch. But there is a quick question. I think, is that Herschella, is that your hand up?
That's my hand up. Yeah.
Okay, go ahead. You have the last question.
Well, I don't have a question. I just want to say, first of all, to Cynthia, I did not know if you were going to be able to join us today. Your presence has made this better. Thank you so much for your courage and your compassion and your capacity to give. So thank you so much for being here. And to Father Kelly, again, you know, we're better knowing you're out there. And for Xavier, you're my heart, you know it, okay? Call your mom sometime, okay? Thank you all for being a part of this. I have watched faces as this was going on. I think that we all felt something and have come to some shared understanding. And this has renewed my belief and my energy to keep the fight going, to keep the momentum, to keep the goodness going. I don't even want to talk about it in terms of fight, but to keep the struggle going. So thank you all so much. I deeply appreciated this. Thank you.
Thank you. And maybe in the 2.5 minutes we have left, I want to just invite really the panelists, just maybe just one word you want us to walk away with to think about as we continue to think about this idea of beyond justice and everything else. Just one word maybe you want us to continue to struggle with and think about.
Yes, mine would be 2 words, Emmanuel, because I can: community and transformation.
Mine would be no child is born bad. No child.
Thank you.
Cynthia?
Cynthia?
Mine, well, my favorite word is forgiveness. So I'll go with forgiveness.
Thank you. And then mine's, I believe, would be inevitably vulnerability. Vulnerability, especially for those of us who are in the system, just being vulnerable and being able to cede power. Thank you all for this time. I guess, Father Dave, you did say 2 words, but maybe we'll walk away with also your quote. This idea, justice is healing grounds and not a battleground. Justice is a healing ground and not a battleground. So as we continue to look and think and be creative about what it looks like beyond punishment. Thank you all for your time and energy and your spirits.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
See you, Xavier.